Morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Morning.
So today we will start chapter 6, which is looking at the development of ballistic skills, so skills where we have to apply a force to move an object. And we'll look at some more of the observation plan ideas to help you out with that. Any questions before I get started? No?
No.
No, ma'am.
Okay. Let's have a look. My remote mouse has died, so I keep forgetting to bring a battery, so I'm going to have to run backwards and forwards here. So this textbook splits object control skills into two subgroups. Ballistic skills in this chapter, and then the next chapter they do manipulative skills like catching. So as I just said, a ballistic skill is one where we have to apply a force to an object to send it somewhere else. So throwing, kicking and striking would all be examples of ballistic skills. And although they're obviously very different motor skills, from a biomechanics perspective, they all follow very similar mechanical principles. So a lot of the ideas that we looked at in chapter 3 apply here in very similar ways to these different skills. So the first one we're going to look at is throwing. And we can have various different versions of throwing. So remember that on the new TGMD we have a one-handed underhand throw now. in field type sports, so cricket, baseball, softball, you'll often see a sidearm kind of throw. And then the one that's the most common in sport is an overarm, either with one hand or with two hands. Okay? So we want to really consider here the assessment of throwing. All right? So we could do a product assessment where we're looking at the outcome, right? How accurate was the throw? How far was the throw? How fast was the throw? All right? But you've got to consider when are those measures useful, right? So it sort of depends on who you're working with. If you're working with an elite athlete, then ball velocity or accuracy, for example, could be very important, right? If you're going to be working with PE students, not athletes, or if you're going to be working at a recreation center, right, with kids, then often those outcome, those product measures aren't as useful as understanding what's happening with the skill, what process, all right? So we want to think about the development and the sequence and where are they in the sequence of development, right? So we get very different outcomes when we change the task constraint here, all right? So we'll talk about that a little bit as we go on. There's a very good lab activity that you can use to practice that idea. So our early stages of our fundamental throwing, think back to our MSU chart, all right? Remember that stage 1 is mostly arm action. We don't see the feet move at all. The elbow goes up and the hand just comes down. So really all we've got is extension at the elbow. All right? Particularly if we're looking at children who are younger than 3, so toddlers would throw like this unless they've got a very experienced older sibling or parent that's working throwing with them. Right? So, and then remember that in stage 2, we also don't see any foot action. So here's a classic stage 1. You can tell just by looking where they've started the video that this is going to be a stage 1. So stage 1 is easy to identify. If you've got a stage 1, you know that what's coming is a horizontal arm swing with the ball flying all over the place. Still no foot action, all right? So as we get more and more practice, then at throwing, we expect the individual to move through those stages on the MSU chart. And remember that when we talked about that, we said that those stages were set up predominantly for a motor pattern that is throwing for force, all right, for distance and force. So as we get better at that pattern, we're going to start to see some wind up, all right? So initially the arm might come back without much trunk action, but once you start swinging that arm harder, it turns the shoulders and the trunk as well, all right? In Initially, we're going to see an ipsilateral step, remember? So the first step that we see is the same foot as the hand that's holding the ball, and then we'll get to an oppositional step, right? So the more proficient we get, once we get to stage 5 of throwing on our MSU chart, we're expecting to see a longer step and an opposite step and some backswing. And then from there on, it just keeps improving if this person is getting a lot of practice. So we'll start to see upper arm and forearm lag. So that means that the forearm is behind the elbow, right? That lag means that I have more time to apply force to the ball, okay? So if we go back to chapter 3, we'll see that that was a way we could add speed or force to the ball. And then we start to see sequential rotation rather than a block rotation. So a block rotation happens when the whole body turns in one piece. A sequential rotation occurs when we see the hips, then the trunk, then the shoulders. All right? So if you watch a very good thrower, especially in slow motion, you'll see that sequence if it's throwing for force. So it's very interesting that the authors picked a young lady to be the model here. In the research, girls are significantly lower developmentally on object control skills than boys, not because there's a physiological reason for that, just because girls don't practice ball skills as much as boys do, typically, right? So this young lady is not typical. She could be a softball player, perhaps, right? Her throwing action is quite good. Still got some work to do there, but it's not bad, right? So she's obviously practicing throwing for a reason. And that's another, there aren't a lot of girls' sports that involve throwing in the same way as there are men's sports, right? So girls don't very often play with throwing. So for throwing, it's a very mechanically complicated skill. And so when we look at the observation plan and the developmental sequence for throwing, whereas on, what day is today? Thursday. Well, on Tuesday when we were looking at the locomotor skills, they only had 2 components, right? So those locomotor skills had a leg action and an arm action, right? When you look at throwing, we have 5 components, right? Because there's a lot going on in throwing. And there's also a lot of researchers who were athletes, and so they like to research throwing. So there's tons and tons of research out there on throwing. And so they have a very clear picture in their head of what the important elements of throwing would be. All right? And so we get these 5 different components. All right? So the developmental sequence is the detailed description for each step, right? And then remember from the developmental sequence, that's useful to look at, but it's not an easy tool to use for assessment. So we're going to develop an observation plan with mostly yes-no type questions. All right. So our components for overarm throwing for force, right, are trunk action, all right, backswing, and some of these components are validated and some of them aren't, but if you talk to the researchers, they say this is what happens in throwing. So the backswing, initially we don't see a backswing, right? Then we would want to see some shoulder flexion, then hopefully we start to get a backswing, and then we get a downward and circular backswing, right? So again, very much like a mini MSU chart for each component. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Okay. Our next two components are the upper arm action and then the forearm action, right? So we've got what's happening with the humerus and then what's happening with the forearm. Right? Unless you're really, really experienced at throwing, like probably Ryan could do this without a camera, I certainly could not. There's no way I could see no lag, delayed lag in real time. Right? If I was going to assess throwing at this kind of detailed level, I would really, really need a camera. Right? These two components are also applicable for overarm striking. So for serving in tennis or serving in volleyball, right? These two components would also be useful there. And then our last component is what's happening with the feet. All right? So as we would expect, first of all, there's no stepping at all. Then we see what they're calling here a homolateral, but that's the same as ipsilateral. Homo or ipsi both mean same. Okay? So same side step as hand. Then a contralateral, an oppositional step with a short step, and then eventually a really long oppositional step. Okay? So then we've got to take this idea and as I said, you go from here to the developmental sequence that is going to flesh out what these steps look like. So it gives you the detailed description of what these stages or steps look like. And then we're going to turn it into an observation plan. So any questions up to here?
No, ma'am.
No? Okay. So, here you can see our 5 components. We have the foot action, the trunk action, the backswing, the humerus, and the forearm. All right? And we've got a series of yes, no, or yes, no type questions where there's only 2 answers, right? An answer that's kind of yes and an answer that's no or something similar. So you'll see here, is the step homo or contralateral, right? So again, there's only two answers. It either is or it isn't, okay? So for the foot action, the first one is a step taken, right? Seems obvious, yes or no, very easy for me to tick that off if I'm watching that. If it's a yes, then the next question is the step same or opposition, right? So if it's the same, we're at step 2 or stage 2 for the feet. If it's an oppositional step, that still doesn't tell us the whole picture of what's happening. So then we need one more question here about how long the step is, okay? Same idea for the trunk, for the backswing, right? No backswing at all if they're in stage 1 or stage 2, right? Does the hand drop below the waist? So that's an interesting question, I think, because it gives you a very clear picture. Like if I take my hand back here, I've got a kind of a backswing, but it wasn't a really mechanically effective backswing, right? So the young lady that we just watched took her elbow straight back here, but she was throwing indoors, and I suspect she's probably a softball player and used to throwing outside, and also we don't know how much room she had in that gym, right? So maybe the fact that she was indoors changed her backswing from this to this. I don't know. I don't know very much about throwing. You might be getting that idea, right? Okay. Humerus action. So we've only got 3 steps here, so 2 questions, and then forearm action. Okay. So this is what you're going to create for the next piece of work that's due, right? And you'll see I've given you a template where you can write the name of the component and then ask a question and do a yes/no answer. Right. Now what's interesting, and it's more obvious with throwing than it is for running because we've got so many more components, is that an individual doesn't achieve the same step for all components at the same time, right? And some people may not ever achieve the higher levels on the arm type action ones, right? Or maybe not even on the backswing. Right? You would hope that everybody would get to a relatively long oppositional step with their throwing, and that there would be some kind of rotation going on, right? So maybe up to step 2 or step 3. Okay. So there's many combinations of all these steps that can occur when you're assessing someone's throwing, right? So they're similar to the MSU chart, but then there's some additional information that we would get from doing a component approach rather than a total body approach, right? Not all combinations will be seen. Not all people, as I said, will move forwards to a high level of every type of component. And if you're teaching this, then you would expect to see improvement in the component that you're specifically targeting in the lesson plan, right? So if I'm not targeting arm lag, then I wouldn't expect to see improvement in arm lag, right? But if I'm targeting stepping and stepping with opposition and the backswing, right? It's really interesting to listen to researchers who are fascinated in throwing, because they have all kinds of, from my perspective, quite amusing arguments about what's the most important type of cue to give someone to teach them to throw well, right? So a friend of mine who was a really good baseball player, he's now a really good researcher and lecturer, his argument is that you should tell the kids to go like that, right? That's his first cue for throwing. That develops all kinds of interesting conversations because a lot of people don't agree with him. But he's a pretty good thrower, so I don't know. Right? I don't teach that level of skill. I can stick with my little people, so it's okay. Any questions about that idea of the observation plan?
No, ma'am.
No? All right, let me see. Where do I want to go? It's there. Okay. So, let's move on. We've said a lot of this already. They don't achieve the same step for each component at the same time. Differences, we've done that. Differences observed between the sexes in throwing skills. So actually, I think that I mentioned to you in lab at the beginning of the semester that the TGMD3 is a new version of the TGMD. And the previous, the TGMD2, came out in, I think it was 2000. And the people that created the TGMD felt that when they started collecting the data for the normative tables for the third version, that they would see some closing of the gap between the boys and the girls. And so what they were hoping was that they would not have to have a separate set of tables for the girls and the boys for ball skills. However, frustratingly, given what we knew back in 2000, right, it's very frustrating that actually what happened was the gap between the boys and the girls still exists, and they still needed a separate table for scoring the girls and a separate table for scoring the boys, which was very disappointing, I think. They were not expecting that to come out of the data collection. Okay. Quite a few studies and research papers are going to suggest that boys are more advanced than girls on most of those components that we were looking at. It's difficult, as I said, because girls don't get a lot of modelling. It's only really in the last maybe less than 10 years, to be honest, that I would say I could turn on ESPN and see a women's softball game, right? So there hasn't been a lot of modelling on TV or in the sports pages of the papers and things about girls throwing, right? And remember the information that we covered again in lab about modelling, right? Modelling is key, so if I'm not getting modelling, two things are going to possibly happen, right? One, I don't think throwing is important for girls because I don't see girls throwing, right? Two, even if I want to throw, I don't have a model, right? I've got to copy a guy. I don't have a role model. I don't have a female athlete that I can say, oh, I want to throw like her, right? So these differences, there's lots of research from preschool through grade like 7 or so, all shows that boys are better. There's research with adults that shows men throw better than women do, on average, right? We're not talking about a specific population, we're talking about the average population. I mean, obviously, if you're a competitive softball player, you're going to throw way, way better than a lot of men that don't compete as athletes, right? But that's not the typical picture, okay? What's interesting about throwing that makes it very different from walking, running, jumping, those locomotor type skills, up until we get to things like hopping or the combined skills that we talked about, walking, running, jumping are very hardwired in a way that throwing is not, right? So children are going to walk, children are going to run, children are going to try jumping if they're typically developing. Whether that is getting modeled to them or not, they're going to give it a go. It's because it's just the way forwards, right? When we get to skills like throwing, unless we get specific practice at them, they don't happen, right? Or they happen, but they never get to a stage that we would say was competent. Okay? And this is one of the interesting arguments against that maturational theory from way, way back that said that motor skills just occur, right? We don't have to teach them, we don't have to practice them, they're just going to happen. And so one of the negative effects of that is that a lot of people just think kids are going to throw. If you give kids a ball, kids will just throw, right? Well, they may throw like this, right, or like this, but that is not transferable into a game, right? So if I want to encourage children to enjoy PE, to enjoy team games, we have to get them competent so that that skill can transfer, right? When you're coaching or teaching these skills, always remember that I want to be side on to the plane of action that I'm interested in tweaking, right? So I've got to be at right angles to the plane of motion. So which component am I the most interested in today? Then I've got to stand at right angles to that component. So older adults who are active, not throwers, right? This is an average typical population, right? So older adults who are relatively active demonstrate moderately advanced steps in throwing. They're okay at throwing, they're not great at throwing, right? But if they've stayed active, if they've stayed healthy, if they don't have any shoulder or elbow or hand type issues, then we see quite good throwing mechanisms for these people, all right? Often the step is quite short, so that component doesn't quite get to the long step for a lot of reasons. One, hip mobility. Two, leg strength to take a long step, right? We still see differences between like this gap that starts in preschool and kindergarten never ever closes, right? So it doesn't matter what age group we look at, we see that girls don't throw, women don't throw, as well as boys or men, right? The more experienced the female is with movement and throwing, then obviously the better form she's going to have, but we really don't get an equivalency at any point. Ball velocities with older adults are about the speed that a 9-year-old would throw. So, again, okay, but not great. There could be all kinds of individual constraints that could affect the motor pattern that emerges for throwing. So if we think about our constraints triangle, right, and our emerging pattern is a throwing pattern, then there's all kinds of muscular or skeletal joint issues that could impact this movement pattern, right? So, throwing isn't quite as stable as walking, running, but it's pretty stable, right? So if I get to a decent level when I'm younger, it's a relatively stable skill over time, all right? So it will change eventually, but the decline is relatively slow in a throwing pattern. Generally, it's more to do with control because of decreased flexibility, for example, or a decrease in type 2 fibers that makes me a bit slower, right? What else? Aha! Okay, now comes a very interesting tweak, right? What happens when I change the goal of the movement? That's not what I wanted. The goal of the movement from throwing for force to throwing for accuracy. Right? Remember that the sequences we're used to looking at for assessing throwing are developed to assess throwing for force or distance. All right? So when I change the goal of the skill, I'm changing a task constraint. Okay? And instead of asking someone to throw as hard as they can, I tell them they have to hit a particular spot. Okay. So what would be, maybe you've not seen it, but do you know of a really extreme example of throwing for accuracy? Now you're at a disadvantage because you live in a country that doesn't have pubs, right? But because it's a pub game. But it's also highly competitive, international. They call it a sport. I hesitate to call it a sport. No? Have you ever watched darts?
No.
No? Ooh, let's see if I can find you a clip of darts. Okay. Here we go. This looks like it's a good one. All right. So, picture in your mind what throwing for force or distance looks like, right? So you picture baseball pitcher, or picture a quarterback, right? Or picture a softball fielder who's throwing the ball back to the base, right? Hold that picture and think about what that looks like, and then look at this. Not at the end.
Oh, this game rules.
That face that is usually covered by her phone has finally made an appearance. That face.
1900 Germans
Alright.
39 in Hildesheim are on their feet. And
So-
a fantastic climax. Dan Dawson in the commentary box to take you through this one alongside Rod Harrington. And a lot of the guys here, these are the two they wanted to see in the final. Let's make no bones about it. I think,
So this is throwing, right? They are applying force to an object to project it elsewhere.
both players evenly matched. The pace of both players.
It's highly accurate. I mean, it's pretty hard to hit where you want to hit.
What happens to one that can get out the gate quickest? Get in front, get one or two legs up, and then just keep pounding that treble 20. 85.
Right? So, but look at this, what do we have now? We have no foot action, right? We have no backswing. We have the throw being created by extending the elbow. So this, if I was checking off markers on my fundamental motor skill, would basically be a stage 1.
You're going to see the real Gary Anderson. My, hasn't he delivered on that? Well, what did that go with? Sets it up, that's all you put.
Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Right? So when we change a constraint, in this case a task constraint, and we say throw for accuracy now, not for force, what we see happen from a motor pattern perspective is that in order to be very, very accurate, people use much lower stages of throwing mechanics, right? Okay. So this could be a problem. It was interesting on the playground this week because always in the spring, it's a little trickier because you've got a group of the older class at the CDC who are right on the edge of transferring to kindergarten. And what you get with that group is much more competitive behavior. You know, they're much more cognitively aware and developed than the baby 3-year-olds, right? So when they're 4.5 or 5, then they start to get quite competitive with each other. And that can prove to be a little bit difficult because I have a throwing target that has numbers on it. And so then they want to hit a higher number than their friend did. Right? But then what happens when I watch them is they move right up to the target so that they can't miss, which means I get this, which isn't what I want, right? So I spend a lot of time trying to get them to back up and throw as hard as they can and not worry about whether they hit the number. But by the time they're 5, they don't care what I say. They want to hit the number, right? So it can be problematical. The next target I buy won't have numbers on it. It might not have anything on it, we'll see. right? Because I want them to throw as hard as they can because I'm not getting a big arm swing or a big step. I don't want them to throw and try to hit the number, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So in sport, it can be a little bit tricky as the teacher or the coach, depending upon the position that you're working with, right? Because in a lot of games, not darts obviously, but in a lot of game situations, what we want is force and accuracy, right? So if I'm the quarterback and I can throw the ball all the way down the field, but it never goes to the receiver who's supposed to be catching it, then it's not a lot of help that I can throw the ball all the way down the field. Right? I have to be able to throw the ball all the way down the field and to the exact person I want it to go to. Right? So we have this force accuracy type of trade-off going on that's going to impact which motor pattern I'm prepared to accept as the teacher. Right? I can't have this huge backswing and all this segmental rotation and this massive long step and get the ball where I want it. Right? Okay. Also means I have to be very careful when I'm assessing that I keep the constraints identical from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment, right? So I have to keep the equipment equivalent. I can't change the weight of the ball. I can't change the distance I'm asking them to throw, right? I have to keep everything as similar as I can to be able to compare the pre-score to the post-score. Okay. Okay, so on to kicking. Kicking's interesting, right? In throwing, one of the things that makes throwing a relatively early skill that we observe in children, if we provide them the opportunity, is that I'm in charge of the equipment, right? I've got the ball in my hand, and I get to throw it when I want to throw it, right? Kicking, however, I'm no longer in control of the thing I'm kicking, right? It's a ballistic skill because in order to make the ball move from point A to point B, I have to apply a force to it. But that ball could be stationary, that ball could be rolling, that ball could be flying through the air, right? So there's much more variability involved in a ballistic skill where I'm not in control of the ball, right? So now we have to integrate perception of the environment and the ball, and we have to link that, we've got to couple that perception with our kicking. Right? So we have what we call eye-foot coordination, right? Because I've got to time this swing and this kick so that I make contact with the ball, right? So that means that the more difficult the skill is, the more movement there would be, right? So the easiest version to teach kids how to kick is to have a stationary ball, right? And then they can walk or run and try to kick the ball. Okay? Once that ball's moving and the child is moving, it becomes very complicated for that little brain to put all those pieces together. It takes a lot of practice to kick a moving ball. Right? So, just by changing again the task constraint, right, the goal of the skill, I can make it simpler or more difficult for the individual who's trying to perform that skill. Okay? And that comes back to the idea that we want that person to have some success. Okay? If they fail every single time, they're going to quit and give up and go away and do something else. Right? So I have to set the task up in a way that allows for different levels of challenge for different individuals. There's got to be a way for someone to be successful, because once they're successful, even if they're successful because they ran up really fast and they kicked the ball, they didn't miss the ball, right? They want to do it again now, right? Put the ball down, I want to do it again. Okay? So we have to build in these levels of success in order to keep people motivated to keep trying, to keep practicing. Because without practice, we don't improve. So, very good example here of stage 1 of kicking on the MSU chart. She does actually take a step, so I think she's got a bit more practice than they're suggesting. But there's no backswing, she toes the ball, there's nothing happening with the arms. I suspect Mummy or Daddy have been practicing kicking a little bit though, since she does take that step in. How cute is that though? If they stayed that age, I'd have had one. But they grew up. Okay. Right, so no step, toe the ball, no, I mean, she takes a step, but on the MSU chart, stage 1 has no step. Toe the ball, no backswing with the leg. So he's coming in a bit faster, has had a bit more practice, his timing, the swing of the leg to the ball. Question, is this child running?
I believe so.
Okay. Anybody else? What do you have to see for it to be running?
You have to have one foot in the air all the time.
Okay.
And as well as arms too, that they're looking forward.
Okay. All right, so, Nira, you were close. You have to have a period of no feet on the floor. There has to be a flight phase for it to be running, not walking. So I can't slow it down. Let's see if I can catch.
I mean, he's kind of like, he's running, isn't he?
It's really close. It's really close. I mean, I'm not sure that I would define that as a flight phase because he's just about at toe off with his right leg and his left foot is already on the floor. I am not sure. I would like to have the ability to slow the film down better and see. I suspect he's walking really quickly, but I could be wrong because it's very difficult to tell without the right software to go frame by frame. Where are we? Okay, we'll finish kicking and then we'll pick up with sidearm striking on Tuesday. So, the more practice I get, then the better I get at kicking. It's quite interesting here in Portales because the rec center and the city have a little, like, I don't know what they call it, junior soccer class at the weekends, and so a lot of the children who are at the CDC play soccer, girls and boys, and so actually you'll see quite good kicking skills from some of the girls, which you wouldn't typically expect to see, but it's because they're going and practicing and they're playing little games with each other and things. So some kind of wind up, right? Remember that we're going to have the leg bent at the back, and as we get better and better and better and better and better, the leg wants to be as straight as it can be as it makes contact with the ball because that would apply the most amount of force. Okay. There should be opposition of the arms with the legs. Again, depending on the level of experience, the level of confidence, you could get a run into the ball, but you'll often see them almost leap into the ball as they get better and better at it. So it's another instance of a leap being involved in a skill. As much range of motion in the hip as possible. So always soccer players, football players at home, soccer players often get groin strains because they do a lot of stretching of their hamstrings, but they forget to stretch out the front of their hip and their groin. And so they get quite, at least they used to. Maybe they're getting better at that now. All right? So much more advanced. Leg still isn't quite straight as it makes contact with the ball, but it's almost straight. Right? You can see a nice big step in. Okay. So look for the characteristics. What am I seeing? If this is the characteristic, what version of that characteristic am I seeing? Okay. So we don't have anywhere near the level of research on kicking as a skill as we do on throwing as a skill, unfortunately. We know the overall kind of pattern that we expect to see, but we don't have the detailed research to give us the full picture of the qualitative changes developmentally in kicking. Right? So the developmental sequence and things in the book, they're not validated, they're hypothesized. This is what we would expect given what we know about biomechanics and what we know about skill development. Right? Certainly does not appear to be an automatic skill. Right? Not all older children and certainly not all adults kick proficiently by any means. So it's clearly a skill that takes a lot of experience and practice to become good at. Being able to generate the force might be the key to kicking well. Kicking for distance, again, similar to the idea of kicking for throwing for distance, we see significant changes in the kicking motion if we ask someone to kick the ball very hard than if we ask them to kick it gently and dribble, right? Dribbling is kind of kicking, I think. Wilson, are you still there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Would you consider, your soccer, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So would you consider dribbling to be kicking, or does the ball never leave your foot?
Well, I mean, when you dribble, you can kick the ball. You'll probably sometimes trip, but I never do skills. I just pass the ball, you know.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Because to me it seems like dribbling would be a version of kicking in the way that throwing a dart is a version of throwing. But maybe,
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah? So when I'm dribbling, I'm trying to be as accurate and keep the ball as close to me as possible. So we see a different movement pattern than when I'm trying to kick a penalty, for example.
Yeah, because the ball is faster than the player, so.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We have a really good tool coming up at the end of the book that will help us answer this question about how do we design developmentally appropriate lesson plans for kicking activities, right, for children at different levels. And so there's a very good teaching tool coming up in this book. I think it's in chapter 18 or 19. All right. There's also, in the book, they also cover punting. I'm not going to cover punting in class, but have a look and go through what they think the sequence looks like for punting. So if I drop, kick the ball. Right. And then we will look at, very quickly, at sidearm striking on Tuesday and probably start the next chapter. Looks like maybe starting the next chapter on Tuesday. Okay? Take a little bit of time to review the observation plan ideas so that you know what you've got to tackle. Okay? I'll make sure that the guidelines are up and that there's an assignment tag for you to click on. I can't remember when it's actually due, but it must be coming up because I think I have it built into the midterm grade. But I can't totally remember. I'll have to look at the syllabus. Okay. Questions for me?
No, no.
No? So remember, you know, what we're doing here, it's not rocket science, right? But it is a lot more clever than people outside of sport and movement give us credit for, right? It's a lot more subtle if you pay attention to all the cues and the idea of the constraints and how do I manipulate constraints to change a movement pattern for someone to help them be better at the skill, right? There's a lot more to it than just watching the skill and yelling at the athlete. Right? If we're going to do it well, and we're going to be good at it. Okay? All right, well, I have almost all the TGMD film up now. I've got one more skill that was missing. But I saw it in my inbox this morning, so I will get that up. And I'm still playing with the intervention film to try to get that up for you for the first analysis. Okay? So I'm hoping I can get that up this afternoon. Depends how many people need to talk to me and get some help on anything. Right? So don't forget to be looking for those. And I think that's it. I think that's it. It's going to be a lovely day. It's a bit windy, but it's lovely and warm. So enjoy. And I'll see you probably next week. Bye.